Welcome to the desert of the real.
And what's this about a doctor's appointment? You're always going to the doctor.
I don't feel good.
So what? You think I feel good? Nobody feels good. After childhood, it's a fact of life. I feel rotten. So what? I don't let it bother me. I don't let it interfere with my job.
Did I fall asleep?
For a little while.
Shall I go now?
If you like.
Everything was fine until we woke up once upon an eternity from the sleep of primordial unity into a dream that wasn't our dream or even a true dream. It was a dream of an unmedicated God and the spiderweb fantasies of our demented egos calcified by whatever brought about childhood's end. We woke up one day and found ourselves in a world we did not make, our souls tied to the carcasses of dead mammals, as Yeats wrote, claustrophobic in a body that was nothing but a tomb, as Plato bemoaned, or more like a prison, as Basilides warned. We woke up as roaches, struggling on our backs in a universe that was but a sewer for the gory waste of an Aeon's abortion.
I am not an animal! I am a human being!
We woke up drunk, suffering from amnesia and plagued by nightmares, as Jung called gods that had become mortal, us. We woke up in a hellish world as nothing more than slaves to silver-haired pharaohs and their soulless institutions, who forced us to build pyramids from the rocks of their own greed and intolerance, meant to be the very tombs of our dreams and opportunity.
You have to understand, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged. And many of them are so inert, so hopelessly dependent on the system, that they will fight to protect it.
The moral landscape teeming with corporate hobgoblins who gorge our psychic throats with the salt water of material desire that could never be quenched, while Botox Baba Yagas in the skies of shallowness tossed us pieces of eye meat riddled with the longing eye maggots of neighborhood status and social network fame and Apple product worship. And they promised we could be free if we toiled harder on the desert sands of yuppie wet dreams or socialist orgasms or religious Scrabble games.
We're the middle children of history, man. No purpose or place.
Be good, but feel bad about yourself when no one is watching. You'll go back to sleep to that primordial unity. Be good. Just take this opium of Kardashian consumerism, thought-atomizing reality shows from the shores of Jersey, Pavlov news programs with demagogic demagogues, compromised romances, and fast food faiths.
Our great war is a spiritual war. Our great depression is our lives.
Be good. Don't let them know that you feel so bad, little roach. What did you dream? It's all right, we told you what to dream. And they further plugged us into the Matrix.
Welcome to the real world.
But some of us shudder partially from this artificial digital dream of an unmedicated God, and the truth breaks our hearts and often the spines of our sanity, or so they tell us little roaches. But we decide to fight our way back, dare the lion-headed, dragon-body gatekeepers to get back to the sleep of primordial unity, the dream of Barbelo and Sophia and Bythos. We decide to rage against a heaven that made this happen by crafting a counterfeit Truman Show or Dark City as a result of poorly cloning the idealized reverie we originally came from.
Ernest Hemingway once wrote, "The world is a fine place and worth fighting for." I agree with the second part.
We decide that raging against the machine is not only so 20th century, but that it won't work because the architect, that great black hole sun, can easily make other Lovecraftian realities dressed up as family ties series. That's what Allah is good at after stealing the power of Mother Wisdom and creating a Tron-like grid from the very voltage of our own fears and insecurities.
I am the architect. I created the Matrix. I've been waiting for you.
And the war begins and continues, for we are the veterans of 1,000 psychic wars. We Johnny Cash bodhisattvas. We existentialist Galahads, riding in between pillars of armed Goliaths. On one side wielding barbed spears of thou shalt, and on the other swinging bastard swords of thou shalt nots.
Those who will not live by the law shall die by the law.
And also that we can reach that holy grail, that golden fleece of I am the true me, the eternal me, the real me, unclothed of my monkey suit and cleansed of my ego vaginal mucus. I am the dream before the artificial dream. I will not take prisoners but liberate them. I am going to battle for a peace I may never experience. I will overcome the Ancient of Days himself and his angels that rule the stars and my baser emotions by becoming aware of this artificial dream, taking my stand upon towers of self-knowledge and summoning down the cross of light where imagination and spoken truth meet in an infinite point.
No matter what anybody tells you, words and ideas can change the world.
It will be a hard fight, pregnant with windmills and clouds in our coffee, but it beats living in Central Egypt on our knees, giving fellatio to big penis gods and their testosterone vagaries.
Prepare to taste God's wrath.
To put it better than my babblement, René Damel wrote, but the great black anti-suns, wells of truth in the essential conspiracy, in the great veil of humpback sky, come and go and suck one another in, and men call them absences. Or as Emile Cioran wrote, injustice governs the universe. All that is made and all that is unmade, the rain carries the imprint of a corrupt frailty, as if matter were the fruit of an outrage in the womb of nothingness.
In one of the countless billions of galaxies in the universe lies a medium-sized star, and one of its satellites, a green and insignificant planet, is now dead.
We wake up from Plato's cave together here at Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, broadcast at the virtual Alexandria through the GodAboveGod.com. We wake up together, we who have shuddered into that wakefulness and awareness known as Gnosis. Divided we stand, together we rise, writing our own gospels and living our own myths. We are the revenge of the myth and the lords of deconstruction. We are legend, and we are the champion eternal. And I am Abraxas, your mystagogue and psychopomp, leading you as you lead me to the upper worlds of aeonic sunlight and spiritual liberation, away from the wrong dream and a world we did not make.
You ever have that feeling where you're not sure if you're awake or still dreaming?
And our astral guest on this Saturday, approximately October 23rd, the year of our demiurge 2010, will certainly cast a holy, noetic light in the dark dimensions we dare, in that limbo between the dream of the pleroma and the waking nightmare of Jehovah that smothers our divine spark.
You ever had a dream, Leo, that you were so sure was real? What if you were unable to wake from that dream?
And our guest uses one of the main weapons of Aeon Byte, bringing the wisdom of the ancients into a modern context that can help us navigate this postmodern existentialist world of collective delirium and personal soul nausea.
It's just life. Quincy. Wake up, smell the thorns.
And this is Christopher Knowles, author of Our Gods Wear Spandex and The Secret History of Rock and Roll, an inspiring virile book we will be discussing in this eternal now. For more information on Christopher, please visit his website, secrethistoryofrock.blogspot.com, and then put away your Guitar Hero game for good and urinate on the closest image of Lady Gaga, because you're about to get another epic dose of red pills and Red Bull gnosis.
I fought the good fight. I finished the race. I kept the faith.
Most of us have been deeply touched, moved, and even transformed by the various spectrums of rock music. And dare I say it, rock music has been a religious experience for many of us, attitude-changing, mind-changing, and even life-changing. Rock music has liberated many of us in ways we couldn't have imagined, taken our heart and souls to places we only, dare I say it, dreamt of. A dream world we knew was better than imposed mediocre destinies. Home-like, perhaps, more real than this reality.
I feel like I was meant for something more than this. I want to do something with my life. I want to be somebody.
And Christopher in The Secret History of Rock and Roll tells us exactly why. His theme is simple but satanically brilliant. A concept album journey that is so obvious that, and Christopher expands on this, it had to partly come out of the collective unconscious. And that is basically that rock music is the present and perhaps greatest incarnation and reincarnation of the ancient mystery religions, which were arguably the true bedrock of all that was mystical and transcendental in the Greco-Roman world and long before.
Witness the wonders of an ancient glory.
You see, in ancient times, and now I'm sounding like Neil from Spinal Tap, but again, in ancient times, the pomp and circumstance temple cultures appeased the +5 staff up their ass gods, and appeased the Al Gore seasons, and appeased the priesthood's PayPal accounts with sacrifices and indulgences. Yet there were those who were tired of extroverted dogmas and their airport rules and regulations.
You know, when I was growing up, I hated everything but the faith, the rules, the rituals, endless discussions at the dinner table. I used to sneak into my mom's prayer room, you know, holiest of the holies. I would dance around naked with porn magazines just to defy the gods, tell them to fuck off.
They possess a thirst for deeper planes of existence, believe that the tweets of the divine were not only meant for clerics and slutty oracles, but for the common and uncommon dude. They sought out altered states of consciousness, a direct 4G network with higher realms, and an escape from the taser in the balls effects of ego and death.
Death is only the beginning.
An individual could be gripped by ecstatic transdimensional energies, as well as agonize alongside savior deities and their celestial sacrifices, whether it was Demeter, Isis, Sophia, Osiris, Mithras, Bacchus, Attis, or a minor godman called Jesus Christ.
I like to picture Jesus in a tuxedo t-shirt, because it says, like, I want to be formal, but I'm here to party too. Because I like to party, so I like my Jesus to party.
And these were called the mystery religions, and they thrived across the Egyptian and Greek and Roman and even Jewish civilizations, often wearing the outer clothing of the state creeds just to go under Yaldi Baldi's radar. The mystery religions invited men and women, philosophers and emperors, from Plato to Marcus Aurelius, from Pythagoras to Hadrian, and everyone in between, to unlock the chastity belts of creation herself. The mystery religions were wild mosh pits, soporific raves, and marathon marches that made gay pride parades seem like funeral progressions. gorged with music and dancing and entheogens and fellowship, where the chains of societal constraints were cast away to allow the greater life to flow like a BP oil well, and freedom to flourish in all its potentials and extremes.
You have always been here.
They were also initiatory ceremonies and magical rituals of inner contemplation, where a psychopath often reenacted the myth of a dying rising godman, or the descent of a goddess into the netherworlds in order to cause an internal, nuclear alchemy of his or her own soul. And frequently they were arduous mental and physical gauntlets where the Eidolon, a person's cockroach self, was abused and tortured so that his daemon or godly self descended from Arcadia to hack into the passwords of the fates and lead one to a virtuous and heroic destiny.
If you do not know the present, how can you claim to know the future?
To put it simply, the mystery religions were shamanism for the masses. Just like rock music is also shamanism for the masses when it comes down to it. And again, Christopher in his new book makes a perfect connection. Eventually, the mystery religions were outlawed and extinguished by orthodoxy, existing only in fragments within secret societies or the lore of hidden face in the borderlands. Same old Sphinx excrement, same old Lamia flies, my beloved true seekers.
I can't help thinking somewhere in the universe there has to be something better than man.
Yet with the rise of occultism, the birth of a more egalitarian society, and as a reaction to a postmodern world of grim threats, the mystery religions returned without the world even knowing they were back. The old gods took on new names and manifested upon the earth in temporal flesh to impart their gnosis. The arcane rituals were resurrected, except for the addition of modern technology, as well as leather pants and hairspray, and they thrived in a seemingly popular form of entertainment called rock and roll.
When the long night comes, return to the end of the beginning.
And that is what Christopher's The Secret History of Rock and Roll is all about, my beloved true seekers. It's one of those books I wish I had written. It's a concise journey back to the esoteric riches of the past that retrieves timeless truisms to inspire us to, as the modern personification of Dionysus once sang, break on through to the other side. Like I've said before, the social-political landscape of Roman times is eerily similar to our days, and thus the mystery religions, like the Gnostic spirit, were bound to incarnate in our modern days, and Christopher makes an ironclad case that this has come to be.
If he didn't want me to praise him with music, why implant the desire and then deny me the talent?
I guarantee you, my beloved true seekers, that you'll never see rock music in the same spotlight after the interview, and certainly after you've read The Secret History of Rock and Roll. But enough of my drivel. Christopher Knowles gets on stage. Oh, but first please allow me to introduce a quote by Euripides on the mysteries. Blessed is the happy man who knows the mysteries that gods ordain and sanctifies for his life, joins soul with soul in mystic unity, and, by due ritual made pure, enters the ecstasy of mountain solitudes, who observes the mystic rites made lawful by the Great Mother, who crown his head with ivy and shake his wand in worship of Dionysus.
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we have the pleasure of having Chris Knowles to discuss his new book, The Secret History of Rock and Roll. How are you doing today, Chris?
I'm doing great.
Well, thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte.
It's my pleasure.
Tell us how you came to write your book, The Secret History of Rock and Roll. Was a connection between rock music and the ancient mystery religions something you had worked on or through for a while, or was there some sort of epiphany?
There was a series of epiphanies. I mean, it really came from growing up during the punk rock era and being involved in the hardcore scene in Boston in the early 80s. I didn't really work it out because I wasn't familiar with the mystery religions. I wasn't familiar with their history. But I sort of intuited that this was a secret society, that this was something, that you might see with Animal House. Like it had its own sort of set of initiations. It had its own rules. It had its own ways of recognition, its own symbolism. It really was a counterculture in the truest sense of the word. It was something that was completely off the radar of the mainstream. It was something that was, for and by and of its audience. It also offered this really profound experiential trip, I mean, you went to these events and it was transformative. If you were wired just right, you would really be changed by this experience. And, certainly seeing The Clash in 1980 really sort of woke up all these dormant parts of my brain, very much a shamanic experience. But, it was all about light and sound and smoke and all those great things. But, that all goes back millennia, and it wouldn't be until much later that I'd realize that basically what I was experiencing at that point in time was just a repackaging, of these very subtle forces that went into hibernation for quite a long time, but sort of emerged back in the post-war era.
Yeah, I know you have a problem with the Clash releasing London Calling, which I had to laugh throughout your book. You never forgave them for going pop, did you?
No, I didn't. Well, I mean, that's a whole other discussion. I think they sort of they cut their own legs out from underneath them. I mean, really what they were all about was, catharsis. It was all about, transcendence.
Could you tell the listener what exactly were the mystery religions and what was their purpose?
It's sort of a catch-all term for a very broad range of cultural phenomena. What we came to understand as the mystery religions sort of popped up in the classical age of Greece. There was this move, we had the philosophers, there was this move towards individualism, towards self-expression, towards the arts, towards philosophy. I mean, these are all very radical new developments, democracy. And what the mystery religions were about is that the old gods of the state, the animist gods, these very distant sort of lofty figures, really had become disengaged from the people, through rote, through repetition, people just sort of going through the motions in these rituals. And people were really looking for a much deeper connection. They were looking for something that was more profound and offered a greater experience. We might be seeing here, the same process that I'm talking about in rock and roll, sort of starting that early on, that these mystery religions were really revivals of Stone Age fertility rituals that goes back to really the beginning of settlement, the beginning of agriculture, where these plays, the whole idea of the seasons and planting and all these sort of things, harvesting, these things were all very mysterious to these people, that how this all worked, why you could not grow crops in certain seasons and things like that. This was all profoundly mysterious. And this culture of the mysteries arose from this. And it was all about these dramas of fertility goddesses and fertility gods descending to the underworld and being reborn. And this is all about, the crops being harvested in the fall. Well, the Greeks only had three seasons, but, being the harvest season and then the winter and then the spring, when things would all be new again, that things would be reborn. And this is really the start of this. And of course, there are much more interesting connections here than just this kind of rote replay of these agricultural cycles, because what we have is shamanism. What we have is these interesting compounds that sort of would show up on the wheat, in the fields, in the forests, these interesting psychoactive compounds that created this, the entire idea of the priesthood really arises from shamanism. It's a very watered down version of it. But it's this whole idea of this extraordinary transformative experience that these people would go through and then bring us into it. And it was bringing you into the mystery, these strange figures and personalities that would be confronted during these experiences. And of course, this is something that I've also been following for a very long time. I mean, when I was a kid, I was really hugely into Carlos Castaneda and the book Altered States. Readers of my blog are familiar with this litany, but Altered States had just a really profound impact on me, the novel, not so much the movie. And I didn't realize how all these disparate things that all seem disconnected are really very, very tightly interwoven. They just sort of manifest, they put on masks and they manifest themselves in different ways.
Yeah, and there's a lot of benefits for the mystery religions. From what I heard, it was more egalitarian. It included women and empowered women. It didn't matter what case you were. And like they said in the Eleusinian mysteries, one thing people always said is that after they'd gone through this ritual or this reenactment of Demeter or this experience, this ecstatic experience of going outside of yourself, one of the effects is you lost your fear of death. You unlock the mystery of life and death.
Yeah, well, that's very true. And it's interesting now that we're seeing all this research talking about mushrooms and things like that being used for terminal patients, that it helps ease their anxieties over dying and stuff like that. I mean, I think that's a really fascinating, this idea of eternal return, people sort of rediscovering lost knowledge. When you talk about egalitarian, the Eleusinian mysteries were a bit more lofty in some regards. Really, my favorite of these mysteries, and the ones I really wish I could write more about, were the Samothracian mysteries, the mysteries of the great gods, the Kabiri. This is where we really start to see rock and roll manifest itself, because these mysteries, first of all, they were open to everyone. Second of all, male, female, foreign, native, whatever, it was all comers. But second of all, this whole idea of literally heavy metal, that these dancers, and this sort of manifests itself later with the Corybantes, and this ties into the mysteries of Kybele and also Mithraism. I mean, it's the through line, but the through line here is these screaming armored warrior priests, these heavy metal guys. I mean, literally heavy metal, where they would play their music with their swords and shields, and these guys would literally scream until their throats were raw, until the mouths were bleeding. I mean, it was this intense experience where these guys would come in during these rituals, and you'd have drummers and you'd have torches, and you'd just have this amazing, really outstanding show, that really we're recreating in rock and roll. But this whole experience, and these guys would come in and they would just blow you away. I mean, you'd be terrified, but you'd be just so completely, filled with admiration for their power and their dedication. And this is something, I mean, I really want to explore this a little bit deeper than, you're sort of allowed to in these kind of books. I would love to write a book just on this mystery itself, because
the myth comes from basically these great hoplite warriors protecting either Zeus or Dionysus by making so much noise the Titans didn't notice them. But you're protecting the god, perhaps the god within you.
But it also, it's interesting too, because, the great gods, they're almost like these Lovecraftian crustacean humanoids, but they're the sons of Hephaestus, aka Vulcan. It's just this, all these memes is sort of, that seems so disparate and disconnected, all just sort of coalesce in these mysteries. And really, if you want to look at the birth of heavy metal, goes back all the way. It really does. It goes back all the way to these mysteries in Samothrace.
What were some other of the more popular mysteries in the ancient times?
Well,
the cult of Dionysus and Isis, I assume, were two big ones. Mithras.
The way it goes is that the Eleusinian mysteries were really the most lofty and the most respected. The Isis mysteries, of course, they're very popular in Egypt, and then very, very soon they begin to migrate all over the Mediterranean, particularly with Alexander. That's when it really accelerates. They enter into Rome, and Rome doesn't want anything to do with it. I mean, Rome has these temples destroyed. Their priests are crucified. I mean, this is really something that the Romans don't want anything to do with. But eventually, the Republic gives way to the Empire, and it sort of sneaks in through the back door with Caligula, who's sort of fascinated by these rumors of temple prostitutes and all these kind of things, these lascivious rumors that sort of follow the ISIS mysteries around. Mithras is a bit later. Mithras really is sort of at the turn of the Common Era. It's maybe about 60 or 70 years before Christ. I have theories on Mithras. I do not believe personally that Mithras is who he claims to be. This whole idea that these Turkish pirates worshipped Mitra, this Zoroastrian god figure, the sun god. I sort of have trouble with that because we're talking this culture that was the arch enemies of Rome, that these two cultures, this whole Persian-Turkish axis in the Eastern Mediterranean is really the mortal enemies of the West, Rome and Greece. I think that Mithras, is basically Horus. I think that there was, I think there was a very strange evolution that sort of went on behind the scenes. And the way you have to sort of look at this is that you have to sort of study Rome and how they saw religion. They really saw that these animal-headed figures of Egypt were ridiculous, that they were embarrassing. They really looked down. They saw the Egyptians in many ways as being degenerate because animals were animals and men were men, right? The lines of demarcation were very clear there. There are, we talk about this whole icon of the Tauroctony, which shows up in Mithraism, around the turn of the millennium. I actually have a paper here, and I'm trying to figure out how the best way to distribute this, but this is something that was really a major sidebar from the major thrust of the book. But I do believe that Mithras was a repackaged version of Horus. And it's interesting how it's sort of, Mithras and Isis really rose to prominence, before Constantine. That, Cybele is still that very, large maternal figure, and you still do have the official state cults, Jupiter and Juno and all this kind of thing that nobody really sort of follows anymore, particularly by that point. But I think that Mithras is really just Horus repackaged. Anyway, we also had the Dionysians, aka the Bacchants, the Maenads. I mean, there were a bunch of names. Dionysus himself had a lot of different names that he was worshipped under. Cybele, the Great Mother, very much sort of a counterpart to Isis and Demeter, but much more lofty, more respectable. The interesting paradox here is that as lofty and respectable and maternal and queenly as Cybele is seen as, her priests are these like cross-dressing eunuchs who are absolute madmen, rock and roll, glam rocking guys 2,000 or 3,000 years ago.
That's what I was thinking, David Bowie or Culture Club kind of people just.
Times 10. I mean, these guys were just madmen. And it's interesting because there's also this, the Corybantes, the Kabiri, the Dactyls, again, a lot of these things have so many different names and so many different cultural sort of permutations that we forget that there's a very core mystery here, that all these different guises, and this is sort of part of my argument with Mithras and Horus, is that it's all the same core ideas there, that sort of emanate in different ways. But, there are all these through lines, that you're going to have your Great Mother, you're going to have your dying, rising vegetation god, you're going to have these priests, these armored priests, you're going to have the rituals with the grains and the mushrooms and all these kind of things. The fascinating thing about all of this to me is just how similar it all was. And really, when you tie this back to a lot of those sort of modern mysteries that I write about on the blog and in my books and stuff, you're talking about something very deep, something implanted very deep in our collective consciousness and our psyches, and I think even very possibly in our DNA.
I agree, and it should be noted that the priests of Kybel would go in such ecstatic trances that they would like castrate themselves, which is, you know, in our day and age, obviously people cut themselves or go into mosh pits and all that, but it's kind of a similar thing. But also continuing with Kybel, there was a person who lived in a center where this mystery is big named Paul of Tarsus. Do you think Paul was just creating a sort of Jewish mystery school as well?
Oh, I have no doubt about it. I mean, this is wading into very controversial waters here, but really this has to do with that the mysteries in Christianity and other groups, certainly, were in such close competition. You know, they're all vying for the same attention, you know, particularly in places like Alexandria. I think that Paul really saw Christ as one of these figures. And that, to me, is, you know, I see Paul as this great genius, this pivotal figure in history, that Paul, you know, Paul is the turning point, not Christ. Paul is the one who sort of codifies this, who wraps this all up into a package that will reach the, you know, the Gentiles, you know, the other nations. I know that there's a lot of controversy about who exactly Paul was and what his identity was. We do know that there was a figure who presented himself as Paul and released these certain writings. I think when you read, you know, the Acts of the Apostles, and you see sort of these strange stories about this figure and how every time he gets into trouble, there always seems to be a garrison of Roman legions to pull him out of the fire. I you know, that's the kind of thing that I think is really fascinating to me, is that these strange little details that are sort of glossed over and spun, you know, it makes me think that at the time people were aware of who this character was, and that he had a very chummy relationship to, particularly to the Praetorian Guard. People gloss over the fact that when he was taken to Rome, I mean, he was put up in a house owned by the Praetorian Guard. And the Praetorian Guard is the Roman Secret Service. I mean, basically, you know, the Roman Gestapo, the secret police. So you really have to sort of wonder. And that's sort of, you know, in my reading and in my exegesis here, lends credibility that this figure did exist. I sort of see the same thing with John the Baptist, that there are all these stories in the Bible about John, you know, outwardly expressing doubt of Jesus' divinity, and they sort of have to be addressed, and they sort of have to be glossed over. You know, when I read the book of Luke, it became really clear to me that at one point there was a corpus of John writings, that there was a John Bible that was destroyed or lost. But, you know, the quotes and all the history that, particularly the book of Luke, is trying to address this controversy that people saw John as the Messiah and not Jesus. And this, of course, we see also in Josephus, who, when he's reporting on the destruction and the dispersal of the Jewish people after 70 AD, that this was all blamed on rejecting John and not Jesus. You know, there's all these sort of interesting things that they try and rewrite and they try and gloss over, but to me, it really speaks to the veracity of who these figures actually are.
So, needless to say, the mystery religions kind of were later on became, well, I don't know about out of fashion, but they were suppressed with the rise of Orthodox Christianity.
Well, here's the thing. This is a power struggle. This is a definite power struggle. And this all has to do with politics. Because I'm not really sure, you know, people like Bart Ehrman, he argues that Constantine thought that, you know, Jesus' father, the God of the Bible, was Saul, you know, was the invincible son. Ehrman's very clear about this. Now, the thing is that the way the mystery sort of evolved and the way they sort of interplay with the religions of the state, that we start to see basically churches. You know, there is the deeper mysteries, these pilgrimages, you know, they're sort of like the Burning Men of the ancient world. But at the same time, there are the lesser mysteries in a sense, that there are these temples that, when, you know, described by people, you know, Budge writes about them, Fraser writes about them, you know, based on earlier historian works, that these things are basically churches. You have holy water, and you have vespers, and you have hymns, and you have candles and incense, and the whole deal that you saw with the church. And the church has sort of absorbed this all. But by the same token, the early church is also seen as a secret society. It's also seen as a mystery. Trajan outlaws all secret societies, all secret assemblies, and I believe it's in 96 AD, and he singles out the Christians, as people who meet in secret, who meet underground, who have these secret rituals, these secret rites. This is the same exact thing as the Mithrists. It's the same phenomenon. The practices are the same. I mean, even a lot of the cosmologies are the same. I think that it's not as radical a break as Christian apologists want us to believe, that the evolution, up until the 3rd and 4th centuries of the mysteries and Christianity are on a parallel track. And of course, a lot of people have written about Christmas and the communion meal and all these sort of things that all these groups had in common. This is all happening at the same time. These people are all rubbing elbows with each other. They're taking each other's ideas. History gets written by the winners. But the real story is that there wasn't really this radical difference. And it wasn't that difficult for Greeks or Egyptians to sort of get on board with the new program that Rome was putting out, because it was all very familiar to them. It just had this, this Jewish mythology grafted onto it. And by that point, the Jews are dispersed for, 200 or 300 years? You know what I'm saying? This is all, it all sort of recedes into the mythological realm, that there was once this nation that was touched by God. That's another thing about the mystery religions that's very fascinating to me, is that all these gods they have to come from somewhere else. They can't come from your backyard. You know what I mean? Kybele, a lot of this comes from Phrygia, this interesting mountainous area in modern day Turkey, how all this emerges in this area. And one of the main reasons that Isis was so popular was, she came from Egypt, the land of the pyramids. This is an impossibly ancient world to people in Rome, almost as it is to us. You know what I mean? It's as shrouded in mystery, And let's not forget that at this point, a lot of the stuff that we know now is probably buried in sand, and it's been buried in sand for 1,000 years. So, this is a very mysterious, you need that distance. You need that sort of grass is greener feeling. You need that sense of removal that you can sort of project your fantasies on, because if it's too close, if it's too familiar, you lose that sense of imagination that really powers the mysteries.
Yeah, I guess that makes perfect sense in Rome, because people used to say, oh, Dionysus really came from the East, and Orpheus came from the East, and Jesus came from this strange land called Palestine. So yeah, I guess for a selling point, like in our days we get all excited about Eastern things, or exotic European thing. Oh my God, it's a heavy metal band from Norway. They've got it.
Yeah, we need that exoticism. We need to sort of project our fantasies on something that we can't attain, and I think that's a powerful force in religion, and also particularly in the mystery religions. Absolutely.
And Chris, what did happen to the pagan? Did the pagan mystery religions completely vanish from history, or were they kept somewhere, or did they just go into the collective unconscious?
There's a lot of controversy about this. There's a book I have, one of the several. I read stacks and stacks of books when I was working on this project. But there's a book that sort of argues that this break wasn't as clean as people believe, that pagans really held out, particularly sort of in the outskirts, outside the major metropolitan areas, for a very long time. Particularly since Rome was so weakened, that central authority was so weakened. This is sort of wading into a little bit more speculative murky waters, but when you look at the Mithrists, there's this power struggle that sort of culminates in the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312. And the Mithrists, the sun worshippers, or the more explicit sun worshippers, they lose the battle to Constantine. Constantine still has to deal with these guys. He's still minting coins with Saul on them. He's still building temples to Saul, because these guys are very well entrenched in the military. They're very well entrenched in the professional classes. They're very well entrenched, in just sort of those alpha male spheres. So he's got to play ball with these guys. Later on, we start to see people like Justinian and Theodosius who are, they're like, all right, we're going to do away with this, and this is a good 60 years after Constantine, but, it's really sort of about, tear down the temples, all this kind of thing, very brutal. You had all these mobs roaming the streets in Alexandria, killing pagans. You had all sorts of massacres. It was really brutal. But this is sort of bringing us into the 4th century. And this is really sort of in the heart of the empire. You have Scandinavia, Germany, the sort of northern rim of civilization that later on we see groups like the Templars and the Cathars sort of emerge from. I really start to wonder if a lot of these groups sort of didn't flee and set up shop there, because a lot of these countries, it's much later on that they're Christianized. And let's not forget also in Ireland that the Celtic Christian Church is a much different phenomenon than the Roman Catholic Church, that it follows a completely different cosmology, theology. It's much more attuned to the more Gnostic streams in the Egyptian Church and things like that. It's really kind of hard to say. It's very messy. We had the Druids who were very powerful in Northern Europe. Eventually, all of this sort of is brought, it's all incorporated. You have people like Gregory the Great who said, let's just, we'll bring these guys into the tent, we'll bring these guys into the fold. And they make all these pagan gods into saints and all this kind of thing, and all these pagan holidays become saints' days and all this kind of thing. It's very much an accommodation. So it's very messy. But later on, we start to see in the Renaissance that a lot of these texts start to reappear. A lot of them were, this whole lore of the Arab traders bringing these Greek texts back into Europe and everything like that. And then we start to see, a lot of monasteries playing host to these secret societies and mystery, like they're going, we're so bored of all this, Jesus nonsense. Let's worship the old gods. And this is really sort of the rise of a lot of this Illuminati and Freemasonry and all this sort of lore about secret societies. It's really a result of, this propaganda war against these revanchist pagan mystery revolutions going on, among the knowledgeable classes, certainly in the Middle Age and definitely through the Renaissance and definitely through the Enlightenment, is when we start to see groups like the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons really, come out into the light. I mean, it's all very garbled. They still don't really have access to a lot of the real core material, but they're sort of trying to recreate that idea in their mind of what they think the mystery religions were all about.
And now, getting to rock and roll, yeah, you've pretty much given examples of the similarities between rock and the mystery religions. Some of them is an altered state of consciousness, an abandonment of the ego in order to take off the clothes of the laws and the rules, a sense of entering the deeper stream of life and the mysteries of death, and an ecstatic feeling of freedom, and all these other things that they share in common. And of course, one of the big ones is to make gods out of mortals, which is what rock does. But why was the ground so fertile in the 50s and 60s to give rise to this new mystery religion called rock?
I think a lot of it had to do with the mass media. A lot of it had to do with people tend to downplay the trauma of the war. Of the wars, really. I mean, you had this whole process of war that starts in World War I, and you have sort of this armistice in the 20s and 30s, and then it heats up again towards the end of the 30s. In ways that we don't really understand yet, I think this sort of shook all the certainties out of Western culture, that the cosmology of a benevolent God and an ordered universe is really upset by the mass carnage that we see in World War II. When the old certainties are shaken, new ones emerge.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of this also had to do, I mean, it's a legacy of the slave trade. I mean, the slave trade was predominantly based in that rim, that western rim of Africa. And this is where the Yoruba people are centered in. And the Yoruba people, where we see Santeria and voodoo, this is a direct lineage back to Egypt. When you really study the Yoruba traditions, the parallels with the mystery traditions, they punch you in the face. I mean, it's just so blatant. And also the same thing happened in Europe, that the Celtic, what we call the Celtic nations, Scotland, Ireland, particularly Ireland, we had the potato famine, we had the occupation by the British, we had these massive waves of immigration to America. This all ties in to the Druids, that this music, even the music itself has these very strange echoes to the music of the Eastern Mediterranean, to North Africa. A lot of these patterns and these rhythms, they're very familiar to these people, that when you listen to real traditional Celtic music, it doesn't really sound all that much different than traditional Greek music or traditional music from Turkey or Syria or Lebanon. Some of these countries that it's all sort of very much ties in. And this has to do with this connection with the Phoenician tin trade, that the Phoenicians were jetting back and forth between Britain, the British Isles, and the Eastern Mediterranean because of the bronze. You needed tin to make bronze, tin and copper. So there was this, we start to see the rise of cosmopolitanism here. So all these ideas are very easily migrating back and forth. And I think the world was not as small as people tend to want to believe it was. And of course, we had missionaries, we had the Druids sort of setting up universities and academies all across Europe. So this sort of hibernates. We see the rise of what we call classical music, which is very ornate music that's really removed from the ideas of dance and the ideas of folk song, that it's this very lofty music that really only appeals to the elites. But the people themselves are listening to the same songs. They're playing the same songs for each other. In the basic sort of 3-chord, 4/4 structure that we're familiar with today, that goes back all the way to the ancient world. On the street, this is what people are listening to. Again, the winners write the history. The winners aren't talking about these folk musics, except for as these sort of anthropological studies. But this is what the people on the street know. This is what they know as music. And with the rise of radio and the record, the phonograph, this just explodes into the mainstream again. And it's really, but again, it's this whole idea of return. I mean, it's not a new thing. It's a return to a much older idea. And I think when you look at certainly rock and roll, a lot of these performers, with the lights and everything like that, I mean, you can just picture, the Stone Age fire circle with the drums going and then boasting about the hunt or the crops or the going up into the mountain and talking to the gods. I mean, you can't imagine it's much different. Light and noise and sound and ecstasy and intoxication. I mean, these are basically hardwired into the human animal,
Of course, it should be noted that probably something that helped a lot was the revival of occultism in the 19th century to the 20th century, which infused that sort of spirituality into music again, which I'm sure joined with originally slave music that evolved into blues and jazz, and this sort of created this great stew, didn't it?
The thing is, though, is that the occult revival sees itself as elite. We have the writings of Jack Parsons where he's having these rituals. I mean, he's not listening to jazz or big beat music. He's listening to crazy classical, so the outer rims of classical music. These guys see themselves as an elite force, as an elite vanguard. So they're not going to be interested in country or, folk song or rhythm and blues or anything like that. And I think when you read sort of the practices and the writings of groups like the Golden Dawn, that, it's all very lofty and formalized and all these sort of things. But what these people are doing is that it's this dripping down, this trickling down of these ideas into the counterculture, and then into junk culture, and then, into pop culture. This is sort of circle where these things sort of bleed down from these sort of esoteric groups into the mainstream. But I don't think that the occult revival itself was really very rock and roll. In a lot of ways, it's sort of anti-rock and roll.
You got to admit that rock and roll, or a good part of rock and roll, is very dependent on the Beast himself, isn't it?
On the Beast, the great Beast, 666?
Yeah, Crowley.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Crowley probably would have been horrified by rock and roll in some regards. But, one of his followers, and I read about this in the book, Harry Smith, is really the guy who made all these field recordings of folk music and blues music and all these kind of rural sounds that really had a huge impact on the 50s and 60s generation, that sort of rediscovering the great American folk song. And this really brings us, into the rock and roll era. And certainly Crowley, has no shortage of fans in heavy metal. But let's not forget that heavy metal sort of had a lot of these classical influences and more complex, more European, more intellectual, as it were, ideas than, the real, usual Rolling Stones song. But of course, Crowley also has a huge influence on Jimmy Page, who really is sort of the avatar of, the new mysteries. He's sort of picking up where Jim Morrison leaves off. But, and it's interesting because Led Zeppelin sort of shows up, just as that 60s generation, that real vanguard. The Beatles are breaking up, the Doors are breaking up, Jimmy and Janis and Jim Morrison are all dying. Led Zeppelin sort of come along and they take all those ideas and they almost I would say weaponize them. You know what I mean? Led Zeppelin distills it all down, and of course they're bringing in a lot of themes, not so much lyrical, but more ideological, from the ancient mysteries.
Yeah, very pagan. And I guess it should be noted, too, that as Tobias Churton wrote in the Gnostic philosophy, a lot of these ideas were not maybe so unconscious, because he states that a lot of the art universities in, let's say, London back in the 60s, places that John Lennon, who was an avid reader of Young, or members of Pink Floyd went to, they were already being taught about Gnosticism and esoteric Greek philosophy and a lot of other stuff. So a lot of these people were already educated on the mysteries or the ancient traditions. They weren't fools.
I don't know how deeply. I don't know how deeply it goes for all of them. I think that they were certainly, this stuff was reemerging in the culture, and I think a lot of this has to do with, we had this real explosion in Freemasonry starting after the First World War, and this sort of becomes the new establishment. That particularly in Britain and the United States, that the Freemasons sort of rise to this new prominence. It starts to wane in the 50s and 60s, but these guys are sort of growing up where all these symbols and ideas, that they're osmosis processed. They're familiar with these things because it's in their environment. I don't know how deeply these guys really went into it, but it's definitely part of their cultural world, their mindset.
Sometimes it almost seems like synchronicity or some sort of providence. Don't you write that the Beatles got their start basically in the ruins of a Roman structure?
Well, this is one of my favorite discoveries of all time. That I spent a lot of time looking at Mithraeums and Mithraic temples, and they all sort of had this very particular architecture to them. These arches, and they always sort of built, there were basement structures that had these curved walls, almost sort of like a half pipe idea. And when you look at a classical Mithraeum, it's almost identical to the Cavern Club in Liverpool where the Beatles played. Now this, probably not coincidental here, because the Roman legions were garrisoned in Liverpool because, the Welsh was Wales, to the west of Liverpool, is sort of the Wild West, of Britain. It's the untamed land. It wouldn't surprise me at all that these guys are set up in Liverpool, and that these structures they make, you hear these stories that the Roman roads, are still being used. These guys knew how to build. There's another interesting thing to me is that the original Cavern Club was on Temple Street. Any temple you see in Britain is a Templar property. And this is something I really researched.
Wow.
That anything you see temple in Britain, Scotland, Wales, maybe even in Ireland as well, was originally a Templar property. The Templars had their big blowout with the church and with the King of France, but their legend was always strong, particularly in Britain, which is France's traditional enemy. So even though they had to go along with the program because the church was dictating it, I don't think that the Templars really went out of style there, and that's why all these temple geographical locations were never renamed, because there was still that great mythology of the Templars. And the interesting thing is that when you look at the practices and a lot of the symbolism of the Templars, it's very, very similar to the Mithras cults. And you kind of have to wonder, if there's a continuity here, an underground continuity.
Chris, you divide the rock movement into different cults, as they were in ancient times. Could you give us a few examples of them and the artists, or more like the gods, that spearheaded these cults?
I don't know if I would use the term cult. I use the term archetype. Cults to me is like, heavy metal, punk, hippie, those are sort of the cults. The archetypes themselves, bands that sort of can be grouped into certain categories that correspond to some of the mystery cults. People all know the terms, Apollonian and Dionysian. Nietzsche used these in The Birth of Tragedy. This is a whole lexicon that we're all very, very familiar with. I think it goes much deeper than that, though. People who casually look at rock and roll will sort of group it all into those two categories. To me, it goes deeper, and what I mean by that is we have groups that sort of correspond to these archetypes and themes that we saw with Isis or that we saw with Mithras. Certainly punk rock I sort of group under, it's a very Mithraic phenomenon, that hardcore punk scene that I took part in a lot of ways was identical to the Mithraists. It's this very strict and severe binary worldview. We talked about the priests of Kybele, the Galloway, and how similar they are to glam rock and glitter rock and all these kind of things. I mean, it's the parallels are really striking. It seems to be something hardwired into our brain, where when you cross those gender boundaries, it unleashes something really ferocious and primal in the brain. It's interesting when you look back at, people always talk about the Stonewall Rebellion. The people who were really at the vanguard of that, back in 1969, where all the drag queens, they were the most violent, participants in that fracas. And we talk about the Earth Mothers. Earth Mother is a term that it sort of comes from this folk blues tradition. The archetype of this, I sort of start with Tina Turner and people like Chrissie Hynde, and I didn't really talk about it too much. When you're dealing with these space restrictions, you have to really be very stringent about who you talk about. But people like Natalie Merchant certainly is a great example of that. And then I sort of talk about, this whole idea of these ancient warrior priests, the Corybantes, the Kabiri, the Dactyls. I mean, all these different names for these groups. But they're very much like, Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Motorhead, this whole idea of dressing up in these armor. Certainly we see the death metal and the black metal bands. Kiss really were the guys who brought this to the forefront, this whole idea of dressing up in these elaborate armored costumes. But that goes right back to the earliest days. And then I talk about sort of this death fixation. You can tie this back to some of the Dionysian cults that had this Plutonian aspect to it. And this to me is, people like Nine Inch Nails and Marilyn Manson, some of the early industrial groups like Velvet Underground, certainly the death metal bands, it's all this Plutonian energy.
And I guess Jim Morrison would be the ultimate greater god of this, of the Dionysian movement.
Well, yeah, I mean, he's a guy who really knows about all the stuff. I mean, he's read about this all. He identifies himself as Dionysian.
Yeah. You mentioned he was actually a very educated man.
Yeah, well, he had a genius IQ, and he was familiar with all this stuff. I mean, he even talked about this explicitly. The way I divide these archetypes is Apollonian, Dionysian, the Earth Mothers, Demeter, etc., Hermetic, the glitter rock, the Galloi, the mysteries of Cybele, Mithraic, the Corybantes, and then the Plutonian, and then also, let's not forget Orpheus. The sad songs say so much, the emo sort of aspect of this, the mopey.
I don't know you could call James Taylor emo, but yeah, sure.
Oh, well, he's the guy who really brings this to the forefront. The whole, just got out of the mental institution and I'm really sad and all my friends are killing themselves. It's like he's the guy who's sort of typifying this. I think that Neil Young is the greatest example of this, especially with that whiny, that plaintive, sad voice, But that's sort of, to me, that's how I end it, this procession of energies, this sunburst, the Apollonian, and then Dionysian, and then these other related things, the Hermetic. But people notice in the book that there's sort of this darkening progression from the heavy metal to the punk to the death metal, and then finally to the emo. And of course, emo and all these, and grunge and all these things, they sort of incorporate a lot of these ideas into this whole like pity party. It all becomes about me and me and my. These guys, if you could not use personal pronouns in your songs, these guys would have no lyrics. It's all very mopey and sad. But I think that that's really how rock and roll is beginning to, this burst of rock and roll is beginning to wind down, how it's beginning to dissipate. That this energy is starting to collapse because everything is becoming so sad and mopey and morbid and all these kind of things. And really what I kind of end the book is saying, listen, we started with this Apollonian Dionysian duopoly, this explosion of energy. But then we end up in this very dark and selfish and defeatist, and that's sort of like the lifespan of this burst. If rock and roll has existed since the Stone Age, we've not seen the end of it. But I, argue that, it needs to reinvent itself. It needs to move forward. It needs to rediscover its roots in some ways. When I see a band go on stage dressed, in their slacker clothes and their t-shirts, it just infuriates me. It's like, have respect for the stage, have respect for this ancient venue that you're stepping onto, I think that the disrespect for things like unison singing, very, very important. Sing-alongs, this shift towards solo singing, I think, was a real sort of degradation. It was a dropping out of that core idea of rock and roll. Again, the whole slacker, sloppy, don't give a shit, don't even brush your hair or shave thing when you come up on stage. You're spitting on your forebears, It's like, entertain the people. And if a lot of these bands are sort of complaining that people like Lady Gaga and all the rest of them are getting all the attention, well, put some effort into your presentation, make good videos. I mean, video, it's interesting how video is so important again, more important in many ways than it's been since the 1980s, that, video makes or breaks a song because we have YouTube and all these other venues for music and stuff. So there was this winding down, there was this dissipation of energy. But I do think that it will cycle back. We will come back to the primal ideas of rock and roll. We just sort of need to filter out all the emo and the grunge and all the defeatism and get back to more core, more vital energies. And I think it's important for us as a culture as well. I mean, because, listen, there's no shortage of bad news on any front these days. Rock and roll should defy that. It should stick the finger in the eye of bad economic news. It should be, you should stand up against that. That's what will give people a way to escape that. They don't need to be reminded of gloominess and slackerdom and all these kind of things. They need to escape from that. And again, this ties back to this whole idea of the ancient mysteries, that it was about escaping your everyday reality and stepping into the transcendent,
See, Chris, I don't know if I agree. I know, because it seems, throughout history, you always had rock always was able to balance it out. Like, for example, the Hermetics or the art rocks of the early 70s were balanced out by the punk rock movement, and then they were balanced out by the new age disco movement, and then you had, grunge was the answer to the glitter heavy metal of the late 80s. But I don't see that happening today. I mean, like you were talking about, you would think that things like the war in Iraq or this recession would just be creating armies of Bruce Springsteens and stuff like that, but it seems like there's no connection.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's why I wrote the book, because I think that somewhere an understanding was lost, that people lost sight of the fact that it isn't just about indulging, yourself, that it's about speaking for others.
It's not about being famous for the sake of being famous.
Well, you need to provide a service to people, and that service is this idea of transcendence, of escape. And I think that one of the reasons that rock and roll, as we understand it, it's still everywhere. It's very much part of the mainstream culture. But what it needs to connect back to is that idea of spectacle, that idea of escape. And I think the problem with a lot of these bands today is that a lot of them might be great musicians, but they don't give anybody anything to care about past the music. They don't give, a band like Led Zeppelin, it wasn't just about the music. It was also about the mystique. It was also about the imagery and the ideas and this whole concept of these rampaging Dionysians and this connection to all these mythological ideas and things from sword and sorcery and all this kind of stuff. It gave people something to enter into. And I think what grunge did is that it bleached all that stuff out. It took it all out. It's like, oh, that's not hip, that's not cool. Let's just be mopey and sad. And the interesting thing is that a lot of this has to do with a sort of rise of, the upper middle class sort of entering into the sphere. When the upper middle class entered into rock and roll in the early 70s, that's when we saw soft rock and all these kind of things. It was all just that same Orphic energy, Orphic / Hermetic. We need to move past that energy and back into these more primal core archetypes, that are more uplifting, that are more fulfilling, that aren't just about, admiring you because your parents were rich and you went to the right schools. You know what I'm saying? And then that's so much of, like, the emo stuff that I remember hearing in the 90s, it was all very collegiate. It was a very college rock kind of thing. It sort of drifted down into the junior high schools. But it was all like, guys wearing preppy clothes. It was this very preppy kind of vibe to it. It was all very collegiate, very sophomoric. And I'm not saying that there isn't a place for that. I'm saying there's a place for everything. But when certain energies rise to dominance over more primal, more vital energies, that weighs down the culture. And I think that's what's happening in rock and roll. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is like, let's get back, let's rediscover a more primal feeling. And if it takes incorporating video games or augmented reality or any kind of technology that you need to provide that venue for escape for people, so be it. But rock and roll in many ways, particularly this whole indie mentality that crept in during the late 80s, has seeded the ground to like a lot of these boring cookie cutter pop and rap groups that, they had the record companies are obviously putting all their money into this stuff. These videos are very expensive, the costumes and the direction and the choreography and all that kind of stuff. Why can't a rock and roll band do something like that? You take what I think is generally better songwriting that you see in a lot of rock groups. Why seed the ground to really crappy songwriting with some of these cookie cutter pop groups just because they have a better understanding of what is going to attract an audience. You understand what I'm saying?
Right.
It's like, get back to entertainment. Entertainment is not something to be dismissed. Entertainment, show business, I mean, it goes back all the way. It's not something to be ashamed.
That's what the ancient priesthood did. They had entertainment.
Yeah, it was a show.
Yeah.
It was a show. When you went to church back in the Middle Ages, I mean, they'd have these giant pipe organs, and, it would take you into heaven, and they built these cathedrals so that the sounds would reverberate in a certain way, so it sounded like the angels were singing along with you. I mean, this was all very deliberate, and the stained glass and the robes, and it's like, give people a show. If you want people to respond, there's certain ways you can do that. There's certain ways you can communicate different ideas. But, listen, when I saw the Clash in 1980 or in 1982 or, whenever, they put on a show. I mean, it was like lights and amps, piled up all across the stage, and video screens and clothing and just the whole thing. I mean, they gave you an experience, Kiss is sort of the greatest example of this. I mean, Kiss have maybe a handful of really great songs that you could sort of enter into the Great American Songbook, but they've been around for 40 odd years because they give people entertainment. They give people a show. They get, when you pay $100, $200 to see a concert, you want to see, you want to come back entertained, you want to come back transformed. And I think that somehow, this whole indie idea that entertainment is bad, that it's déclassé, it's really it's very elitist to me, I mean, a lot of these sort of, and this is something I felt when this stuff sort of started to arise in the early 80s, with what they called the college rock movement. I saw it as all being very elitist, very aloof, very disconnected from more primal energies. I mean, a lot of that stuff I liked. I mean, I loved REM's early records, and some of those groups were really good. But they brought along something with them that I think might have poisoned the well a bit. But by the same token, don't also forget that REM made a lot of great videos and put a lot of effort into making really entertaining videos, and that had a large part to do with their success in the late 80s and the early 90s,
All right, Chris. Well, I think that's all the time we have today. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte and discussing your new book. Fascinating read and a great book I highly recommend for the listeners.
Oh, thank you very much.
All right, we will talk to you soon, and good luck with the book.
Thank you.
And there you have it, my beloved truth seekers. Christopher Knowles, author of Our Gods Wear Spandex and The Secret History of Rock and Roll. For more information on Christopher, please visit his website, secrethistoryofrock.blogspot.com. Certainly a book for you cultural mythicists and synchro mystics and yuppie esotericists and geeky occultists, or anyone who loves rock music. And you can go beyond rock music, of course, and see the mystery religion influence in raves and rap music, cathartic house music, and jazz voyages through the heavens, or whatever has touched you far beneath your monkey flesh. I mean, there is a deeper reason why people grind and jump around like dorks in nightclubs, other than it's fun. Pythagoras and others that we've discussed in past episodes of Aeon Byte spoke how the universe is a radiating musical tone, the building block for the material and the immaterial. And to draw into this stream of vibration is to draw closer to the source of the all, the divine imagination or the original consciousness. Or maybe you're just looking to hook up and get laid and get drunk like the cast of Jersey Shore. Pick the extroverted or introverted gods you want, like they did in ancient times. You can either wake up to the material that will disintegrate your soul, humanity, or return the image of God to the dream of unity of Bythos, where you will become higher than all the gods, as the apocalypse of Adam and other Sethian writings tells us. The choice is yours. But like Christopher and I discussed, It seems either rock is dead or I've fallen under the KISS category of, if it's too loud, you're too old. But there does seem to be a disconnect, my beloved truth seekers. With all the wars and social-political corruption and global uncertainty, you would think that the Luciferian artists and poets would be leading the charge of the young and the tired and the civically hungry. But there are no hierophants for the modern mysteries. We should have legions of Springsteens and Lennons and Dylans and Waters and so forth. If Bono is the best we have, then we might as well bend over and let Jehovah corn dog us without even asking for a reach around. Somehow we have become severe, not only to the Apollo source, but the ancient sources that have so many lessons. We've also become obviously disengaged from the collective unconscious and the eternal realm itself. Few entertainers, our modern shamans and soul alchemists, speak with the holy spigot or the joyful rage of Dionysus through them anymore. What has happened? Simple. The Archons are winning. They're drawing us deeper into the dream of the unmedicated God. We feel powerless and groggy and quietly desperate. But that is why the Gnostic revolution is so important. And that is what people like Christopher are doing with their works, getting us to wake up to the real dream, that dream of you, where you don't have to worship a rock god, but you can become one, or anything you want to be. Write your own gospel and live your own myth like the Gnostics throughout history were hated and loved for doing. And that is why you come here every week to the virtual Alexandria, to one of its districts where you can hear Aeon Byte Gnostic radio. Not many of you come, mind you, so it's important to spread the word and get the word out and just listen to the word. We're frogs in slow boiling water, and our deaths will be like a whimper, but the final devouring of our divine sparks will be as loud as a Fran Drescher orgasm. We're running out of time, and Jehovah continues with his dark fantasies, ever since Athena or Wisdom sprung out of his skull because he had a headache or something like that. Couldn't open the jar of Advil, who knows? So, as a small motivation and a small homily, I leave you with two quotes. The first from the Testimony of Truth. And what is the light? And what is the darkness? And who is the one who created the earth? And who is God? And who are the angels? And what is soul and what is spirit? And where is the voice? And who is the one who speaks? And who is the one who hears? Let me know when you know that answer. And the other one is from the Trimorphic Protonoia. It is through me that Gnosis comes forth. I dwell in the ineffable and unknowable ones. I am perception and knowledge, uttering a voice by means of thought. I am the real voice. And I'm sure you can quote right now a dozen rock songs that capture the Gnostic spirit and the spirit's desire for ultimate and complete freedom. Let's take both the stairway to heaven and highway to hell together, my beloved truth seekers. Or keep laying on your back like a roach in a universe that is but a sewer for the gory waste of an aeon's abortion. Hello and goodbye as always.